Hi, everybody. Welcome to a very interesting webinar. I promise you, you will not want to stop listening to us. We're going to be so amazing. But just to tell you that we are speaking on the topic of how the UN Cybercrime Treaty is advancing transnational repression in Southeast Asia. So thank you to everyone who's joining us on this live feed. And thank you to all our panelists and organizers for this webinar. Now, when we talk about transnational repression and Manushya Foundation, which is hosting the ASEAN Regional Coalition to hashtag Stop Digital Dictatorship, Manushya is one of the leading organizations in this region working against transnational repression. And when we talk about transnational repression, we mean the ability of repressive regimes to get their talons and their claws into human rights defenders that are in other parts of the region. So even if human rights defenders are able to get to safety in another place, these repressive regimes find ways to commit transnational repression. And the UN Cybercrime Treaty, which is supposed to be a tool for cooperation against cybercrime, a framework for keeping people safe online, is being weaponized. Because safe for whom? We're asking this question today. What we are seeing across this region is a pattern. Governments are not simply using digital tools to fight crime. They are actually using digital tools, including weaponizing the UN Cybercrime Treaty to fight dissent. They are stretching cybersecurity laws rather than protecting our privacy, our online property. They're actually using these so-called cybercrime laws to criminalize free speech, to use data requests to track people, human rights defenders in exile, and leaning on social media platforms to expose activists. So instead of feeling safer, we are actually being targeted with the tools that are supposed to protect us. And now, with this UN Cybercrime Treaty, for human rights defenders in Southeast Asia, we're seeing another big cudgel that can be used by repressive regimes to perpetuate further transnational repression. So this is what the session is about. It's not talking about the treaty as a technical instrument, but talking about this UN Cybercrime Treaty as a political one and its implications for democratic space that civil society in our region is fighting so hard to protect. We have 5 exceptional voices with us today who will take us from the global picture to realities on the ground in our region. So it's my pleasure. It's always my pleasure to introduce Emilie Palamy Pradichit, an international human rights lawyer and the founder and executive director of Manushya Foundation, which she established in 2017. Oh my. Yeah, I remember when it started, Emilie. Congratulations. Now, Manushya Foundation is a decolonial, intersectional feminist organization shifting power to frontline communities and women human rights defenders across Asia by creating cross-border safety nets of protection, solidarity, and accountability. Emilie, can you please map for us how transnational repression operates in digital spaces and why this treaty's cooperation mechanisms make an already dangerous landscape even more perilous? Over to you, Emilie. And 12 minutes, I got the timer on.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you for all the members of the ASEAN Regional Coalition to Stop Digital Dictatorship to be part of this webinar, and to Jean, our digital rights advisor, for pushing us really to do this webinar despite RightsCon, not happening. So what I really want to begin today is I want to begin with a simple question, because when we talk about transnational repression, we need to talk about people living in exile. And so what does exile mean in the digital age? And, for many human rights defenders, journalists, dissidents, and refugees, crossing borders doesn't mean anymore reaching safety. Today, authoritarian governments in our region, from Laos, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Myanmar, from China, they no longer need to cross borders to physically silence critics. They can cross them digitally. And so transnational repression is not a series of isolated abuses. It's really an architecture of control built through surveillance, immigration systems, extradition, security laws, digital platforms, diplomatic pressure, and international cooperation. It really allows authoritarian states to monitor, intimidate, criminalize, and punish people long after they have fled. And so when we think of transnational repression, we often think of kidnapping, enforced disappearance, assassinations, or forced returns, forced deportations. But those abuses still happen. But increasingly, they are at the end of the story. They are not the very beginning. So today, what we really want to focus, we really want people to understand that transnational repression starts online. Today, your phone becomes the border, your messages become surveillance, and your online activity becomes evidence. Through spyware, hacking, online harassment, AI-generated disinformation, and mass surveillance, authoritarian states can definitely identify, monitor, and target critics wherever they are. And so digital repression is really the end goal. As I said, it's often the first stage of a much broader architecture of repression. That is why today, our discussion on the UN Cybercrime Treaty matters, because the question is it's not whether states should cooperate to combat cybercrimes. They should. The question is what happens when governments that already weaponize law, surveillance, and borders are given even more mechanism for cross-border cooperation in order to commit transnational repression. And so as today, I will briefly explain what TNR is. So transnational repression is TNR in short, how digital technologies have transformed the way it operates, and why stronger international cooperation must be matched by having, very, very strong human rights safeguards. So let's look at what is transnational repression and mainly what came out in terms of international human rights framework. So for so long, there was no definition for transnational repression because it has always existed. Cases of enforced disappearance, cases of extrajudicial killing have always taken place. But the term transnational repression really was brought up by Freedom House. And it's only in 2025, in June 2025, that ORCHR came up with a briefing and with a specific definition for transnational repression. And so ORCHR defines TNR as acts conducted or directed by a state or its proxy to deter, silence, or punish dissent, criticism, or human rights advocacy expressed from outside its territory. And so this is a definition, this is a very important definition because it captures what survivors already know, that repression does not always arrive with a uniform, a warrant, or an official order. It can come through embassies, police, intelligence services, immigration authorities, online mobs, tech companies, criminal networks, private spyware companies, and proxy actors. And so it is deeply embedded within legal system, which is precisely what makes TNR so dangerous and under the radar, because most of the time, immigration laws are being weaponized in order to commit TNR. So now let's look at what are the different forms of TNR. So ORCHR briefs remind us that TNR is not a single act, right? But a range of interconnected practices that build on one another. And ORCHR has identified 6 forms of transnational repression. This is critical because institutions often wait until the violence becomes visible, when someone disappears, when someone is detained, or when someone is killed. Most of the time, institutions wait that happens in order to take action. But it's really an architecture that has already been operating. So the harm is not only one incident, but a whole ecosystem of fear. So let's look at the first form of TNR. The first form of TNR is related to violence and intimidation outside the country. And so this is the first form, this is the most visible form, it's violence and intimidation. This includes surveillance, kidnapping, assassination, arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearance, and rendition. And in Southeast Asia, these are not abstract risks. And one of the reasons why, at Manushya, we are working heavily on TNR is because Thailand has become a regional hub. Thailand has become the regional hub of Southeast Asia, and Thailand has become the top country, the top host countries of transnational repression cases. And so I'm going to give you an example of a Lao activist. So the person that you see on the picture, his name is Otsayavong. He's a Lao activist who disappeared in Bangkok in August 2019. And until today, we don't know. We have not found his body. And so he's a victim of enforced disappearance. And it happened right after a few months after he met with the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, before his visit to Laos, but also a month before the ASEAN People's Forum that took place in Bangkok in September 2019. So he was arrested a month before because he was planning protest against the Lao government. And so this is a reality that many, activists living in exile live. It's that when they are crossing the border, it doesn't automatically mean that they are in heaven when they come to Bangkok. Crossing the border, it's only changing the location of danger. And so now let's move to the second form of TNR. The second form of TNR is extradition request, arrest, and deportation. And so this is where repression starts to hide behind paperwork. This is where we see, immigration laws being weaponized, extradition, bilateral treaties being weaponized, in order to arrest activists. And through extradition requests, unlawful arrest, deportation, Interpol abuse, terrorism labels, criminal prosecution, and slap against people living in exile. That's how TNR operates behind legality. And so this is really for state violence dressed as legal procedures. A deportation order can look administrative. An extradition request can look routine. A terrorism label can look like public security, but in reality, all these are being weaponized to crack down on dissenting voices and human rights defenders who fled authoritarian states in order to seek safety. And so we have the famous case, of the Uyghurs who were recently deported back to China from Thailand, and it was clear cooperation between the Thai government and the Chinese government. The Chinese government claiming that they are now safe in China, and that the deportation was to make sure that they would be safer in China rather than being jailed in the immigration detention center, when in reality they should have been released and freed. Now let's look at the third form of TNR. And so the third form of TNR is really the abuse of security laws with extraterritorial provision. And so this is specifically dangerous because authoritarian states often frame dissent as terrorist, extremist, and always use cybercrime or public disorder or threats to national security in order to crack down on dissenting voices. And so here we have the famous case of Equip Bidap, a Vietnamese montagnard activist who was arrested in Thailand in June 2024 on an extradition request from Vietnam because he's been tried in absentia in Vietnam and accused, of terrorism. And this is exactly how authoritarian cooperation works, is when states convert legal architecture into tools of political control. And he was sadly deported to Vietnam in November 2025 after being jailed more than a year in Thailand. The fourth form of TNR is impediments to mobility. And so it's really about restricting mobility. And that's often when we see, cancellation of passport, refusal of consular services, revocation of nationality, and denial of reentry. So it may sound bureaucratic, but it's really how transnational repression operates. It's when immigration laws, are being weaponized. And for people in exile, these are tools for entrapment, because mobility documents such as passports or visa can mean the difference between safety and detention. So when states cancel passport or refuse documents, or when Thai authorities, refuse to renew a visa, that's when, legal precarity takes place, and that's when people living in exile become at risk of being arrested. And that's how immigration laws are being weaponized. Because when you no longer have a valid visa, you no longer have a valid passport, you become an illegal alien in Thailand. And then that's when the immigration police can arrest you. The immigration police is not going to arrest you if you're on a valid visa. They always wait for your visa to expire or for your documentation papers to expire. The fifth form now of TNR, it's proxy punishment of families and associates. And so it really demonstrates, how transnational repression is deeply relational and operates within a broader ecology of risk. Authoritarian states know that activists do not live alone. They know that they have parents, children, partners, siblings, colleagues, communities, and people they love. And so they weaponize that love against activists. And when they are no longer able to reach the activists directly, they punish the people around them. So families may face threats, surveillance, loss of livelihood, detention, torture, or social welfare removal. We have cases in Cambodia, when parents have gotten the social security or the poor people card, removed because their son or their daughter or activist hiding in Thailand. And so this is a gender tactic too, because attacks and threats against family and children are often common among women human rights defenders. Now, the last form of TNR, which is the most important for us now, is the digital threats or attacks. And this is now one of the most acute and under-addressed form of TNR because it's happening online. It includes hacking, malware, phishing, online harassment, surveillance, smear campaigns, doxing, website blocking, internet shutdown, cyber attacks against individual and organization. And so really digital repression really allows authoritarian control to cross borders instantly. And we must be very clear because online violence is not less real violence. And it's for women and LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders, digital attacks are designed to shame, sexualize, discredit, and silence. And so TNR often begins online long before it becomes physical. Now I'm just going to share quickly the case of Bopa, who is a woman human rights defender from Cambodia who faced, technology facilitated gender-based violence. And so she fled Cambodia to escape unjust imprisonment for her activism. But even after fleeing, the attacks continued online. She faced sexualized threatening messages, fake accounts, coordinated harassment, misogynistic attacks, and hacking of her movement's Facebook page, known for exposing extractive development projects, facing corruption. And her Facebook page of her organization has more than 450,000 followers. So this is not a random abuse. This is technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and it is political violence. It's meant to discipline women to speak, women who organize, women who refuse to be silenced, women who expose state violence. And the goal is to warn every other woman watching her, this is what happens when you resist. When you resist, you will be facing with online gender-based violence. And so cybercrime and digital governance cannot be treated as mere technical issues. They are really gendered human rights issues. Now, the next case is the case of Keo, who is a Lao human rights activist. And so he is also facing digital attacks that can also create digital physical risk. So he's a Lao activist hiding in Thailand who was targeted after publishing political content online. And he has been facing coordinated harassment, death threats, AI-generated violence, and incitement campaigns. People calling Lao authorities, fake accounts supported by Lao authorities calling for other Lao migrant workers in Thailand to go after him and to kill him. And so these attacks are not merely digital, they are part of the machinery of repression. And so really, for us, digital repression is really the gateway to physical repression. Next slide, please. And so, in other words, digital attacks do not simply happen online. They prepare the ground for detention, for deportation, for refoulement, for enforced disappearance, and even extrajudicial killing. This is why we really must understand TNR as a continuum rather than isolated incidents. And the digital sphere is increasingly the entry point into a much broader architecture of repression. And the issue that we're facing today is that there's an accountability gaps that enable TNR. And this is really one of the biggest governance challenges that we are facing today in the 21st century, is that there are no specific legislation that would target TNR. Cases are fragmented across international human rights law, refugee law, criminal justice system, immigration and extradition procedures. But this fragmentation is really dangerous because it allows states to disguise repression as ordinary legal or administrative action. And so, next slide, please. When we are looking at the lack of the accountability gaps, we also realize that there's no specific international human rights treaty that targets transnational repression, and so states feel that they don't have any state obligation, to address TNR. But even without a dedicated TNR treaty, states remain bound by existing international human rights law. And so we have the ICCPR, we have the Convention Against Torture, we have the Refugee Convention, we have the Convention on Enforced Disappearance, we also have the UN Declaration for Human Rights Defenders. All those treaties and declarations are key states' obligations that they cannot avoid. So they cannot pretend that TNR is not an issue and that there's no state obligation, to address TNR. And so it's really important that origin states, for them to not target people abroad through violence, intimidation, and proxy actors. And it's very important for host states like Thailand to protect people at risk, investigate threats, and to ensure due process. So the issue is not that there is no law. The issue is really that we need a political will. And impunity is not a gap in knowledge. It's really a failure of power. So now my final slide, it's about the UN Cybercrime Treaty, which we are focusing today. And so we really believe that the UN Cybercrime Treaty is expanding the architecture of TNR. So the concern is not that international cooperation is inherently problematic. International cooperation is essential, for combating genuine cybercrime. But the concern really is what happens when you have governments like Laos, Vietnam, China, Myanmar, Cambodia that already criminalize dissent when they are being given broader mechanism to cooperate across border. It's for sure that the treaty expands opportunity for those states to request electronic evidence, exchange digital information, strengthen law enforcement cooperation, and facilitate cross-border investigation. In countries where peaceful activism, journalism, or political position are already prosecuted as threats to national security or cybercrime, the same mechanism risks being weaponized against human rights defenders, journalists, refugees, and political dissidents. And so the question before us is therefore not simply how states cooperate, but really who they cooperate against, under what legal safeguards, and with what accountability. Because authoritarian governments are already cooperating across borders, and human rights protection, it is essential that human rights protection does the same. So it's really important for us to close by saying that across borders, it's important to stop repression and to start protection. So this is the last slide. Transnational repression is not accidental. It is not only abuse. It is an architecture built through law, borders, and surveillance. And it's really important for states to stop transnational repression. We must stop treating digital attacks as separate from physical harm. We must stop treating deportation as neutral immigration decision. Across borders, we must stop repression, and we must start protection. And so we also have some slides where we can see some of our publication when we are talking about, the Cybercrime Treaty. But Jean is going to talk more and dig more into the Cybercrime Treaty. But it was really important for me to explain to people what is TNR and that protection must not be bureaucratic while survivors are fighting for survival. And survivors should not have to survive institution in order to survive repression. So let's stop transnational repression and let's start protection. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emilie. So Emilie's really set the scene and reminded us, stop the repression and start the protection. And this is the question. The UN Cybercrime Treaty was adopted in December 2024. 76 states have signed the treaty, but for the treaty to enter into force, you actually need 40 member states to ratify. At the moment, 3 states have ratified: Qatar, Azerbaijan, These are countries not very well known for protection of human rights, or especially protection of non-citizens in their territories. But also Vietnam has signed, and it's not surprising that Vietnam has ratified. It's the only Asian country that's ratified this treaty so far. So only 3 states have ratified. And you can already see from the cases that Emilie has shared that Vietnam has been particularly vicious in terms of committing transnational repression. So it doesn't look good for us to have, because there is clearly a protection gap in the UN Cybercrime Treaty. Many of the states have already used security cooperation, like they've abused Interpol red notices to go after, to commit transnational repression. And so it's my pleasure now, when we talk about this treaty, to actually have a leading regional digital expert. Dr. Jean Linis-Dinco is the digital rights advisor at Manushya Foundation. She holds a PhD. So yes, she's a PhD doctor and not any other doctor. But she holds a PhD in cybersecurity from the University of New South Wales. Jean, can you explain to us the digital side of transnational repression and how it actually looks like in online spaces, the mechanics of it, the human cost of it, and the lessons we learned, especially from the Philippines? Over to you, Jean. 12 minutes.
Thank you. The first thing that I want people to understand about how transnational repression work in the digital realm is understanding that the tools that make it possible are not weapons that are manufactured in secret. They are products. They are sold through sales teams at conferences. They have glossy brochures and they have customer supports. Pegasus, for instance, is one of the prime example of this. It is this spyware developed by NSO Group, designed to covertly install on devices. And according to their 2021 Transparency and Responsibility report, they claim that they have 60 clients in 40 countries around the world. It says here, Pegasus is not a mass surveillance technology and only collects data from mobile devices and of specific individuals suspected to be involved in serious crime and terror. But the profitability of the surveillance market is what has exactly caused it to expand. Outsourcing operations to private corporations that provides government with a layer of plausible deniability that allows them to project power while complicating attribution. Because if you look at what Forbidden Stories, which is a consortium of 80 journalists across a handful of media organizations, they found that when they investigated 50,000 phone numbers that leaked from NSO client data, the leaked data showed that at least 180 journalists have been selected as targets in countries like India, Mexico, Morocco, France, among others. But these are 80 journalists. They're not suspect, they're not serious criminals, they're journalists. And even among the victims were several journalists from the Pegasus project itself. And in 2021, they also repeated that their goal is to help states protect their citizens and save lives. And of course, it was repeated again in 2023, repeated in 2024, that save lives and protect public infrastructure. The surveillance industry is a sector, and we have to understand it as such. Therefore, it has valuations and venture capital and acquisition targets and secondary markets, and it behaves exactly as every other sector that behaves under the compulsion of competition. It expands, it innovates, it seeks new clients, it drives down the cost of entry, and it produces more product than any individual state originally demanded because the logic of accumulation requires it to. And this company's transparency report is swimming in corporate language. They always cite UN treaties when convenient, including the infamous UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, some people in the room may say that, You know what, Jane? Citing the UNGP is actually a misuse of the framework, and I beg to differ. The UNGP were adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011, and they were designed as a deliberate soft law instrument, voluntary, non-binding, and explicitly structured to avoid imposing legal liabilities on corporations. Now, if the UNGP represents the soft architecture of impunity, then the United Nations Conventions Against Cybercrime is the hard architecture of repression. The mechanism of weaponization is the Mutual Legal Assistance Framework, Articles 35 up to 52 of the Convention. They create a binding, treaty-mandated infrastructure for cross-border data sharing between states. So a government that wants information about a dissident living overseas no longer needs to covertly hack their phone. Now, they no longer needs to hire a contractor. It can now make formal requests for preserved electronic data, traffic records, content intercepts, and subscriber information from the state where the dissident has actually taken refuge. The treaty also contains human rights provisions. And I know we have been here before. We have seen what it looks like when a framework is built with the language of rights and the architecture of impunity. The convention adds powerful new capabilities to a growing toolkit of abusive governments that's already fueling abuse on a global scale. Transnational repression, as Emilie have said in her previous in the previous slide, shown in her presentation, sorry, that that is not contested. That is the reality that the people in this room, the people doing this work, live with every day. And here's what people need to understand about this treaty. The treaty did not invent transnational repression. You know, Pegasus was already out there. It's already being sold, already being pointed at journalists' phones before they knew what was happening. Governments were already pressuring telecoms, cutting bilateral deals behind closed doors, already finding informal ways to reach borders for people who thought that crossing border meant something. So what this treaty does then, maybe you were wondering, is what? Is take all of that, every single piece of it, and give it a pathway. A legal pathway, a stamp of the United Nations flag, a treaty-mandated, officially sanctioned, procedurally legitimate pathway. And you don't need to pressure a telecom company in the dark anymore. You don't need to invoke, you just need to invoke the mutual legal assistance framework. You don't need informal arrangement, the secret bilateral meetings, the contractor with plausible deniability. You have a convention adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. And it is worth remembering that during the negotiations for this treaty, there was a long list of additional offenses, including punishment for speech deemed to promote extremism or threaten national security that governments want added. Well, this wish list did not make it into the final text. They're already queued for the next round because by 2027, the optional protocol negotiations will begin. The authoritarian states that drove this treaty will come back to the table with the same demands and stronger procedural position. So what we have now, assembled in place are three interlocking layers. A commercial spyware industry that sells the tools of surveillance to any government that pays, accountable to no one, a voluntary human rights framework that is as useless as it gets, and now a binding international treaty that institutionalizes cross-border data sharing without enforceable protections, negotiated by authoritarian state, sign in an authoritarian capital and already being stripped of its remaining safeguards by the governments most eager to deploy it against the people who have managed to reach the apparent safety of another country's soil. All these layers of architecture was built in public. Layers was criticized in public. In fact, Manushya even sent our submissions. Even we joined all this so-called consultative efforts that they are trying to bring us in. And each layer was adopted anyway, because the states and interests that benefit from it are the same states and the same interests with power to determine what international law looks like, and the question of whose voice permits is not only answered in targeting of individual journalists, it is answered in the construction of the legal infrastructure with which that targeting becomes routine, impossible to challenge from the outside, and now treaty sanctioned. But no, I do not think that we can rely on governments or corporations or philanthropy in that matter, regardless of who is in power to do the work that only mass movements can do. The policy responses, a drafting of a treaty for transnational companies, all of these matter, and we should press for them, but they are not sufficient because they leave intact the commercial architecture through which surveillance is built, sold, and deployed. And they leave intact the diplomatic relationships that shield perpetrator states. They leave intact the platforms whose infrastructure is the medium of repression. But what the moment this time and moment decide or needs is transnational solidarity. If there's transnational repression, what it demands as an answer is transnational solidarity. Because right now, repression at this scale is not just a state project. No, it is an industry. It is an industry where commodification is the most efficient method that humanity has yet devised for scaling any function, including the surveillance and silencing of those in power. Because every government contract is simultaneously an act of a political repression, and it is a unit of economic production. Because somewhere right now, God knows where, there is an investor probably sitting in a pension fund or a private equity portfolio or a technology venture fund who owns a small piece of a surveillance company. They have never heard of a journalist being surveilled. They've never read the Forbidden Stories investigation. They wake up in the morning and check whether their investment is up or down. And when it's up, hep, hep, hooray. And what they do not say, what the market is specifically designed to prevent them from seeing, is the chain that connects their return to its source. Their investment generates a profit, and that profit comes from a government contract, and that contract pays a surveillance tool, and that tool pointed at the journalist. That journalist sources are exposed, the journalist's life is endangered, those sources are endangered. So every link and that chain is real. The investor, the endangered source, we are all connected directly by money. But the market translates that connection into a financial instrument, doesn't it? A share price, a line the portfolio, and a quarterly return. Charismatic, isn't it? And in that translation, the human being at the end of the chain disappears, and the investor is not required to know where they are and who they are. The law does not require it, neither the market. The transparency report so certainly doesn't. And this is the deeper purpose of turning repression into a product. Not just that it can be sold, but that once it's sold, nobody who profits from it has to think about what happens. The money moves, the harm happens, and between the two, the market stands as a wall that accountability cannot cross. Acts of transnational repression are carried out online using tactics such as digital intimidation, and they're expanding every year. The question is what we intend to do with that recognition. Freedom, freedom cannot be secure for some while others live under algorithmic siege, because the struggle against digital transnational repression is not a niche concern, as some would always say, that for cybersecurity or infosec experts or even human rights lawyers, because it is the most contemporary expression of a very old question that we all know: whose voice does power permit, and what is it willing to do to silence the rest? And I think we all know the answer to that for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for that very spirited and thought-provoking sharing. And, when we talk about, Emilie talked about the ecosystem of fear, and Jean Jean mentioned the algorithmic siege, that we are under siege from these online restrictions, not just restrictions, but this online attacks. And Jean highlights the fact that for many companies, repression is profitable. They are out to make a profit. Profit comes before people. And therefore, we do need to question why, and we do need to resist why it is profitable for companies to sell tools of repression without really taking due diligence to understand how their products can be weaponized and to take measures to prevent that from happening. Pegasus being a case in point. And you know, I as someone who's been engaged in business and human rights and corporate accountability work for quite some time, I always have a little bit of a cringe whenever the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is mentioned. But I do need to also highlight that since 2014, the UN has been engaged in a process which has been actively participated by civil society to draft a legally binding treaty on transnational corporations and other business entities. Now, this body to do the drafting this whole drafting process has been dragging on for 12 years. But the UN Cybercrime Treaty only took 5 years to draft, from 2019, and then adopted in December 2019, and then adopted by the UN in December 2024. And let's not forget, even during those 5 years, COVID intervened, and that didn't seem to stop the momentum of drafting something that could be very seriously and significantly weaponized against human rights defenders. I wanted to note that we've received greetings from the Philippines, from South Korea, from Thailand, from Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee camp in Bangladesh, and Taiwan. And someone did mention in response to Jean's discussion of corporate accountability and reminded us that the European Union did adopt a corporate sustainability due diligence directive in July 2024, but it still hasn't really been operationalized. Many bodies of the EU, including EU missions overseas, including in Asia, do not seem to understand or know about this important due diligence mechanism, which is supposed to ensure that EU businesses do not cause profit from or cause human rights violations. And from Emilie and Jean from Manushya Foundation, it is my pleasure to introduce Seng Sovathana, the Executive Director of the Cambodian Center for Human Rights. Now, the Cambodian Center for Human Rights, along with ALTSEAN, SAFEnet, and Rohingya Maìyafuìnor Collaborative Network, who are participating in this webinar, are all members of the ASEAN Regional Coalition to #Stop Digital Dictatorship. The CCHR is an independent, non-aligned NGO dedicated to promoting democracy and protecting human rights, particularly civic and political rights in Cambodia. And Cambodia is a case in point where the government or the regime there has methodically dismantled independent media and political opposition and has already demonstrated how it pursues critics beyond its control. So Sovathana, the floor is yours for the next 12 minutes. We're listening.
Thank you. Yeah, I thank you everyone. Give this opportunity to share what our regional team have conducted study, especially the case of Cambodia. So, as you might see that is the I would say that this Cambodia related to repression does not stop at the border as our present the case Cambodia, where the critic have always offense happening to their security under threat. So can just next slide please. So this is just my content with the key point what I would like to mention about the pluralism weakenings, and the second is related to critics pursues in abroad, and also the last related to cooperation as misuse violate to the human rights defenders and activists. Yeah, as you can see here, as what I want to say, the central our achievement is related to the political environments, especially at the ground, at the country level, where is the political competition could be also lead in terms of under constraints. Repression also happenings, as you know, especially from the decent voice and from the opposition groups who have also feeling pressure in that. Sometimes it's quietly pursue, and also under the procedural with the legal weaponized pseudo groups. So as you can see, these are some of the young activists happening, sometimes also with the legal, can say legal reform or amendment, and also are the purpose to restrict rather than to support those activism. And decent voice often criminalized. You can see in this photo, it's quite clear among those young people who are just works protect on the environments, they face that such of the criminalization, and also among their team also many of them are in the prison in Cambodia. Next please. Yeah, and also we see that this how it's what's happening, even those who are exiled outside Cambodia, maybe in other neighboring countries, and also in Europe, in US. But we see that this also exile as necessary, but it's not really safe, because as you can see, the repression is not just beyond it go beyond with the border, and as our first and second speaker has clearly mentioned, that is used such a technology for surveillance and oppress. But at the same time, they also back to their family, friends, relative in home. They also under surveillance and threats. It's really pressure to those who are active online and in speaking out. So I see in this perspective, to me, it's like the border is lost the meaning. That's it can go anywhere around the world because of the such of a technology. They can track and all this happening. Yeah. And also you can look at here as the mechanism cross-border intimidation. It's sometimes happening is very soft, very polite, just request information where you use passport, IDs, or you have any documents. And sometimes the way how the treats, if those who are especially among the activists, political activists, they feel fear, yeah? when such a way in which it look like come out to their house, to their family. Some even they are in outside Cambodia, but somebody would go knock the door and check their IDs, how you feel, because sometimes those people are very strange, they don't know each other. Either they are police or just civilian clothes, and it's create a fears. And also the legal cooperation also happening, especially with the Asian countries. So those are activists in the neighboring country. Sometimes they also bring them back, and those are people come back to Cambodia. They are deported back. End up in jail. We see also clearly from CCHR and other civil society organizations also document in this case. Especially case from Thailand, from the Malaysia also for the last few years was happening. So I would emphasize that quickly is that this sometimes also I call that is indirect pressure on this their family, their relatives. It's happened in such way. So again, this sometimes it's like more in terms of look like the support, but in reality is underway the threat surveillance. What I can say, yeah. So we see clearly of the patterns was happening again and again from time to time. So as I said earlier, that is even those people try to live, exercise in abroad, or developing any safe place, but it could not find those, as the state, the governments have cooperate each other and and try to bring back and give them different reason, accuse them as the especially a threat, criminalized charge against them and put in jail 5 to 7 years or even more than that. And I say that these activists, especially who are most active online, they are consistently target to those people and their family also at home. So as we see from the experience, it can be say predictable. It's happening. It really how their life face those challenge and constraint, even those they are outside Cambodia. Next. Yeah. This you can see some of the picture that. Clearly a threat, especially as the first speakers mentioned, where the treaties was provided. We suppose that the treaty could protect those people, especially the living outside Cambodia, but unfortunately they are really weak in terms enforce the law. It's not really committed from the UN and also relevant authority who are signed those treaty, and from our document experience, like the case here, you can see many hand and behind, though are supposed they also could waiting to leave to the third country, but unfortunately many of them also sent back to Cambodia. Next, please. Yeah, there also the other experience here in terms of the you thought that is would be the legitimacy as the UN treaty as legitimate for the country signatory, but we see that doesn't really enforce and also extend behind, and also the activists, political activists also was killed is really happening, in outside Cambodia, and also some people also, some activists also was beaten. You can see the on his head also happening already, as the example clearly mentioned about that. Yeah, next. Yeah, and I would say the point here as very important to its logic in behind that the threatening surveillance intimidation, it travel around the globe and outside Cambodia. You can see anywhere, but the threat is follow those people. Even they are exiled, but not really protects. Sometimes surveillance come back to Cambodia in jail. So, and again, my point is want to emphasize that even though the treaties were signed, but it's not really safe, secure, protect them. So we would strongly to appeal to the treaty bodies and the UN to look back to review as how could be protect the activist, political activists in Cambodia, also in the region that I would call for. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Seng Sovathana, from the Cambodian Center for Human Rights. For folks who are just joining us, welcome to the to this webinar by the ASEAN Regional Coalition to #Stop Digital Dictatorship, how the UN Cybercrime Treaty is advancing transnational repression in Southeast Asia instead of protecting us. We heard from Emilie Palamy Pradichit, the Executive Director and founder of Manushya Foundation, who gave us quite a comprehensive overview of what transnational repression is, and basically alerted us to the fact that this ecosystem of fear is going to be even more strengthened by the UN Cybercrime Treaty, because it is more likely to be weaponized by countries in this region, in the ASEAN region, practicing transnational repression. Dr. Jean Linis-Dinco, digital advisor to Manushya Foundation, also highlighted that companies are actually benefiting from transnational repression, with companies building and selling digital tools for transnational repression, like Pegasus and other corporations, are making a lot of profit by selling tools and software that is actually used and weaponized by governments to repress dissent and to surveil ordinary people for legitimately expressing themselves. And Seng Sovathana reminded us that these transnational repression is a pattern, not exception to the way most of our governments are behaving, doubly emphasizing to us that we should really question the UN Cybercrime Treaty. So we've heard from 3 speakers, and next up, it is my pleasure to introduce Yasmin Ullah, the Executive Director of the Rohingya Maìyafuìnor Collaborative Network. It's a Rohingya-led, women-led, and refugee-led organization working across human rights, sexual and gender-based violence, education, narrative change, and trans-local solidarity, grounded in a women, peace, and security framework. Yasmin's leadership centers Rohingya women who have survived genocide, trafficking, and systematic violence, ensuring their voices shape solutions at local, national, and international levels. Yasmin, welcome, and you have the floor for the next 12 minutes.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I'm so sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much to Manushya team and the coalition for this very timely opportunity to actually speak on the transnational repression and cybercrimes that are really exacerbating day by day as government increasingly embrace digital governance and transnational cooperation on cybercrimes. We also must confront the uncomfortable reality that the same legal technological tools can be weaponized to silence victims, excuse me, erase evidence and entrench impunity. And for the Rohingya, this is the case. For us, online hate speech has never been just merely harmful rhetoric or just, a blip in reality. It had really served as a precursor to genocide, and now increasingly as a tool of collective amnesia that distorts history, normalize denial, and enables perpetrators to evade accountability. We've seen this in just the recent month or so, where increased hate speech targeted towards Rohingya conveniently paired, or ensued after Min Aung Hlaing, the architect of the Rohingya genocide and the sham president who stole an election from the people from Burma, Myanmar, has now installed himself as the president. And right, soon after the entire debacle of him becoming president, we also see that there is a peeling back or a withdrawal from accountability and justice mechanism, or any pursuit towards it within the region. And this is, without counting the sort of charm offensive diplomatic relations that Myanmar military is trying to actually pursue in order to silence victims and silence cases like ours that we brought under the universal jurisdiction for, under the new penal code in Indonesia on the case of Rohingya genocide. All of this are not separated. They are all, intertwined in the sort of ecosystem of fear that other panelists have already kindly mentioned. So in examining how the UN Cybercrime Treaty may facilitate transnational repression in Southeast Asia, we must ask not only who is protected by these mechanisms, but whose voices risk being criminalized, erased, and forgotten. I'm going to share a very quick slide. Just give me one moment. It might actually take a little bit more time. I'm not sure if my computer will allow that, but please just bear with me. Can you guys see?
Yes. You just
Okay.
need to go to full screen mode.
All right. Give me just one moment. Hopefully this will, okay, perfect. So, just as we are looking at some of the hate speech that has been a recurring issue within the Rohingya community and across Southeast Asia against Rohingya, we are also seeing this in terms of an issue that doesn't go away because there are other exacerbating factors like entrenched issues of lack of management when it comes to lack of management or not enough thereof of the Rohingya refugee crisis. And when we look at the refugee crisis, we cannot just look at how the Rohingya are suffering or what is not happening on the ground. We also have to look at the root causes. And unfortunately, a lot of times in the UN system or in the global system, we look at issues as separate, issues. And so that's where, our fatal flaw is. When it comes to the Rohingya hate speech that is now reemerge in part of Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysia and partly in Indonesia. This renewal of hate speech against Rohingya or hate campaigns against Rohingya can be categorized into these 4 different major categories, as my team has done some research on this. Of course, the dehumanization, the collective blame and criminalization of Rohingya, the stereotyping that we're one way or another, the ethnic cleansing or genocidal rhetoric, denial of identity and belonging, which is basically completely refusing what our history might have been, and conspiracy and misinformation narratives. This is just outright lies about Rohingya, and violence supportive or genocidal language. And I just want to like quickly go over some of the slides just for you to have some ideas. I'm not going to stop at them for too long, but some of these dehumanization, talks about Rohingya being parasite, pigs, monkeys, and various other non-human objects. And that's kind of shifted the sort of worldview that, instead the Rohingya are no longer brethren or people that are in need of help. We're shifted into this non-human subject. And this is just some of the comments that we've collected so far. There are also collective blame that we've commit so many crimes, that we've raised the crime level or crime rate, and we rape, kidnap. None of this, though, has a new or nuanced outlook of the refugees or Rohingya issues across the board. You might see the same language play out in some other parts of the world, especially in Europe and many others, where the country is shifted towards, nationalist ideological mode. And that's the same language that you're going to see. Or also, go back to your country, take all your people and fight for your own land. Like, why aren't you fighting for your own land? We basically, there's the new hashtag is free Malaysia from Rohingya, and go die and like kill yourself. All of this is not something that's so distant. I'm talking from a personal perspective as well. To this day, the comments still rushing in on my personal account and on RMCN's Instagram and Facebook, as well as TikTok, unfortunately. Now, these are some of the language that we've already seen. The next one is a very interesting recycled meme or recycled material from, you guessed it, the time that Rohingya were about to be, the military junta were about to approach into Rakhine State and actually commit the genocidal campaign in 2017. These were the exact same photos and memes that were used. And basically, why are you running away from your own country? No wonder Myanmar threw you away. I now understand why Myanmar military did what they did. And so they also try to emphasize or underline the sort of rhetoric that already exists against Rohingya, against our belonging, saying that we're not a real ethnic group, that we're just, somehow emerged from bamboo shoots and, somehow existed to be a problem for everybody. We're illegal migrants and not real Muslims. So that, again, not real Muslims, why? Because then it absolves people who are Muslims from having to help us, because there is such a strong connotation when it comes to, helping other Muslims. Now, these are some of the historical revisions that I was talking about earlier, and it's basically undermining Rohingya fight for our own liberation, but at the same time, it also goes in line with what the military junta has been desperately trying to create as a rhetoric for the past many decades, to ensure that the Rohingya no longer can lay claim to our own homeland. Now, there are also conspiracy about, Rohingya being Zionist, about Rohingya taking Malaysia's land, where we want to take Selayang, we want citizenship. There's somehow, this president of Rohingya, that title never existed. We breed too much. We pretend to be Muslim. We don't know how to read the proclamation of faith. Again, none of this has any real base, any real facts to them. And again, like some of these AI pictures, unfortunately, this was of me clearly, and then of course with the Israeli flag. These are all basically dovetailing after the very strong emotional response that some of the Malaysia and Indonesia public sector has towards the genocide in Gaza. And now basically people are talking about how the military junta and AA basically are trying to cleanse the country, and therefore we should applaud them for trying to do that, because look at what they're doing in Malaysia. Little little bit of the genocidal language that we're also seeing is why it was great that Myanmar is doing what it was doing. Myanmar should have killed you, and this is why. So it's unfortunately this is the highest severity of the language that we see, that we've documented, and basically all of this is actually going to become the groundwork not only for the transnational repression, for refugee lives in Malaysia to be terrible, with children being terrorized in broad daylight, and no one actually does anything to stop the people who commit these terror. We're also going to see real policies shift. Unfortunately, before I talk about the policy side of things, these are some of the real threats that Malaysians have actually tried to use to basically threaten our team into silence, especially for Azizah. The acid threat, basically talking about basically convincing a Malaysian in Sydney to be able to actually find her and throw acid in her face. These are some very, very real threats that exist, not only just directed towards Rohingya activists or people who speak up, but actual community that are not doing anything to harm anybody, apart from the friction that exists between host and refugee community, that is also very much emblematic of the symptoms of the lack of care and the lack of resources. Now, what is very, very interesting is, and I'll end it here, is that when we see the sort of pattern of what has happened, again, what happened in Malaysia and what happened in Indonesia a few years back are all creating moral panic, creating security threats framework that Rohingya are a threat rather than refugees in need of help, political scapegoating, offline, mobilization, paid students, real world harassment. Election period is also coming up in both of these cases. And there's also simplified enemy, basically me versus you sort of narratives, and targeting a powerless group, or targeting a group that cannot really have any sort of effects on policy apart from those outside who are working to better it. These are all very, very clear example of how these efforts in transnational repression and the lack of safeguarding in terms of human rights from the Cybercrime Treaty can actually help create and shape narratives about a group of people to no longer be able to access not only the collective sympathy, but also the ability to push past the current narratives that limits us into this very, very small group of people, not able to actually realize our own dreams, our own liberation, and then also suppress us into basically not being able to advocate for ourselves. On top of that, it also create this frustration and creating this basically almost hostile livelihood towards Rohingya, to basically allow for policies that come in the future that would justify deportation or other cruel mechanism or measures towards Rohingya, because there is this backing of this public frustration. There's also political implications in many other ways. This also intensify, public pressure towards political leaders and push them further and further towards, a more fascist landscape or worldview. I've seen progressive leaders or progressive MPs talking about, oh, Malaysia for Malaysians, and that in and of itself, there's a lot more that we can talk about it, but this specific phrase has basically brought about the whiplash of, a very populist leadership that has now plagued the entire world. We're also seeing, the public frustration, also justifying crimes against vulnerable groups, especially children, where, tons and tons of people have laughed in a video where a Rohingya child is being terrorized. And that really strip away from our own humanity when, when a public is actually pitted against, a group of people who are so vulnerable, and they're now completely stripped of their humanity and empathy. It lays the groundwork for much, much more ease when it comes to further mass atrocity. And so we're seeing the same pattern. We're seeing the same pattern, not just Malaysia and Indonesia. We're also seeing it being a repetition of the lead up to the Rohingya genocide in 2017. And my question here is, how many more of these waves of violence and hate speech against Rohingya will we have to witness before countries, governments, and agencies actually come together to address the issues at hand? Because are we waiting for another mass atrocity to take place? And that is, I think, that is the question that I'm going to leave for everybody. I'm going to stop sharing now. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. As a Malaysian, it's a very deep source of shame that Malaysians have some Malaysians have whipped themselves into a hateful frenzy and are actually trying to openly call, they've actually publicly called and used the phrase ethnic cleansing of Rohingya from Malaysia. They have actually perpetuated the hate and congratulated the military junta of Burma for committing genocide of the Rohingya. So this is, in the case of the Rohingya, we're actually seeing transnational genocide, not just transnational repression, because all the hate and the actions are really trying to extend the reach of genocide to Rohingya who have arrived in Malaysia. So, and this is, I think, very much linking back to Emilie and Jean's assertion about offline impacts of online transnational repression. So we are actually going to go to our final speaker, Nenden Arum, Executive Director of SAFEnet, Southeast Asian Freedom of Expression Network. Under her leadership, SAFEnet has become a vital force for digital rights and international internet freedom across the region, and a lifeline to survivors of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. This is a term that Emilie also raised, technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And then Yasmin talked about how the offline hate, how the hate translated from online hate to offline violence in both Malaysia and Indonesia. So we're really interested to hear from you about what protection mechanisms SAFEnet has been able to carry out in face of these horrific challenges. Thank you. The floor is yours, Nenden.
Okay, thank you, Debbie, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for Manushya Foundation for having me today as well. As Debbie mentioned earlier, that my organization mostly working on the digital rights. So maybe I will focus on how this new UN Convention on Cybercrime, it's actually become a new threat on the digital freedom in Indonesia. I will also touch about the effort that SAFEnet did so far regarding how we support the victims of the violations on the digital space. So, but as Emilie and Jin mentioned earlier about how the UN Cybercrime Treaty is actually sounds like a good idea, that this convention is like this intention to like stop hackers, online scams, and other cross-border crime. But if we look closely at the details, so it's actually this agreement has some serious issues. So today, as we've done in SAFEnet in research and advocacy, we will look this treaty might actually become a new tool that limits our online freedom rather than protecting us. So I will deep dive on from the Indonesian context. So currently, Indonesia has not officially signed or approved this treaty, or our status is at 0 because the document is still being reviewed by our government officials and diplomats at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, this doesn't mean that we can ignore this treaty or this convention, because behind the scene, local law enforcement and state security agency are already preparing for the possibility of Indonesia adopting this treaty. So when it's approved, it's actually give authorities a global and UN sanction backing that the convention will, this will be justification for the government to implement some sort of like a very problematic articles on this treaty. So this could make it easier for the government to justify a high-level digital monitoring and surveillance right here at our home at Indonesia, or either other country that actually ratify the UN Cybercrime Convention. So what makes this treaty so risky? So actually the biggest problem is what's the missing on the document. So SAFEnet pointed out that we already like send the official letter to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we mentioned some of the problematic articles on the treaty, how it's actually the treaty lacks of basic human rights safeguards, and then that's actually quite risky, because like there's no tricky principles of justice on the treaty about the legality, necessity, and non-discrimination rights. So we believe that without these principles, government are allowed to monitor digital communication without having clear even public domestic laws to guide them. So it also means that the police do not need to treat the digital surveillance as a last resort. They can use this digital surveillance in daily life, right? Even worse, without a strict rule against discrimination, authorities can easily focus their monitoring tools to the critical voice, to the concerned citizen that criticize the government, for example, like journalists, activists, and political opposition without any real checkpoints. Yeah. So this is something that we see the missing pillar of justice on the UN Convention is really harmful for the concerned and very concerned citizen. And then next, we also need to see how it's actually the real situation in Indonesia right now. As Jasmine mentioned, that the online harm, and then how the very harmful content targeting Rohingya, refugees, or even other minorities community in Indonesia is everywhere in the digital space. So this is the situation that we cannot ignore, and then how it's actually, other than the online, the harmful online content, we also need to see how it's actually the regulation in our country is already repressive. So for example, we have this electronic information transaction law or internet law that frequently used to silence activists, students, and journalists. We have also seen a lot of like digital attacks like doxing, hacking, and even internet shutdown during protests in Indonesia. For example, during the last year demonstration on the August 2025, we even seen that the tech platform, the digital platform, took down a lot of like content under pressure from the government. Even TikTok has to suspend their live features because these live features is actually record a lot of like violence on the protests on in the movement. Last year, we also documenting more than 300 criminalization cases that brought under this internet law in Indonesia that targeting citizens for their online expression, for their content related to the protest, and even the content related to the criticism for the public policy of the government, for example. And then the number of criminalization is actually has continued to rise year after year. Although the law, the internet law, has been amended twice in 2016 and 2024, but these revisions have brought no meaningful improvements to the protection of the freedom of expression in Indonesia. So now imagine if what happened when we add this UN treaty to the mix of the regulation in Indonesia. So we believe under this treaty, Indonesian authorities will not be limited by national border. If an Indonesian citizen living abroad posts a critical comment online from our government about our government, for example, the authority can use the articles in the internet laws to request the private subscriber data to the foreign tech company. So this means that the post that is actually legal in one country where the user lives, for example, someone in exile in the Australia or other country, could still be targeted by the Indonesian authority. So it takes domestic censorship and make it global, right? So this is something that we really concerned about. So if Indonesia ratifies the UN Convention on the cybercrime, there will be three major things that will change. Next, for example, I think there will be the state can expand their legal tools, so they can sharing digital data across border, which is currently a slow, complicated process with human rights checks. But with this UN convention, it will be automated and routine because it's become one of the agreement, across related to data across border regarding it's also relevant with the data of the user monitoring and like that. And then under that, we also seen that there will be also domestic law alignment, right, on how the parliament can have a really perfect reason or legalization and justification how to make a law, internet law, even more restrictive and expand state access to the private data by refer to the UN convention, right? And then next, with all this kind of situation, we've seen that there will be three main threats to our daily digital lives. The first one is, of course, the shrinking civic space. Simply online debates or criticism of the public policies can easily be classified as a serious crime. And then we also seen that the activists will be targeted, of course. The treaty gives a local police more power to track digital footprints of human rights defenders. And then we also will face the cross-border exposure. So our private message will lose their safeguard. So this directly affect vulnerable groups. For example, Papuan advocates living abroad could face cross-border data requests, and then Indonesian journalists overseas will lose their safe havens, and the secure encrypted apps that we use every day to talk to our families and our colleagues will face heavy legal pressure to build backdoors for the government. So next, I will be quick. This is some dangerous clauses that we also already sent it to our foreign affairs minister. Is about the article number 2 and 35 that the treaty says that the police can use invasive digital tracking tools for any crime that carries a minimum prison sentence of 4 years under local law. So under internet law in Indonesia, the defamation cases, the hate speech cases with the problematic definition can fall under this article. So this will become the loopholes for the authorities that they don't need a very major cyber crime like hacking or ransomware, for example, but they can use simply a simple act like a defamation or some criticism can be labeled as a defamation or hate speech, and they can justify it under the UN convention. And then next is about the unchecked surveillance. We also seen that it means that the police do not need a judge warrant or a court letter when they are start tracking phone or messages of the citizen. So this something is also very risky because the treaty also threatened about the encryption, that by allowing government to force service provider to build backdoors and bypass their security settings. Next, the last one is about the transnational repression. It's already mentioned in all as we discussed in this forum, how it can also facilitate the transnational repression, how it's also mentioned about how the political dissidents can also become a target by the repressive regime, and then they can face the digital transnational. So that's why we urging our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to refuse the ratification of the convention, because Indonesia, as the world's third largest democracy, we need to be proud of our history on supporting human rights in Southeast Asian nations. So we mentioned that if the government signing this treaty, so it goes against those values. So we demand that our government reject this UN Cybercrime Convention and must work closely with civil society to protect the digital rights. So other than we send the petition to the our minister, we also doing grassroots work. So we now have a collective and collaboration with civil society across Indonesia to provide a support and accompaniment to the digital rights violation victims. We have the digital safety consultation for them. We also provide this digital safety protocols, and of course we also build the solidarity not only in Indonesia but across region to support anyone who become the victims of this digital transnational repression. So yeah, I will stop there, and then thank you very much for listening about the Indonesian current situation. Thank you. Back to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Nenden, and thank you for that very comprehensive breakdown of the different clauses that directly threaten not just Indonesians, but people from the region in general. As the white-haired older person in the room, I am worried because I do recall the Suharto days, and it looks like the UN Cybercrime Treaty, if ratified and adopted by the Indonesian government, will take Indonesia back into the bad old days of Suharto regime, but with more comprehensive and invasive tools. So it would be Suharto regime on steroids. And so thank you for actually making that petition, but also please let us know if you want anyone from the region to sign it. Please open it up. I think we really do need to add our voices, because we know that Indonesia is really a frontline state in ASEAN, being the biggest member of ASEAN. We've run out of time. This has been an amazing sharing from 5 exceptional speakers: Emilie, Jean, Sovathana, Yasmin, and Nenden. So instead of a Q&A session, I'd like to ask everyone all the speakers, all the panelists to please open your camera so we can have a group shot. I really want to encourage everyone who watched this or even watched part of this to please go back to the recording and listen again, because there's a lot of really important details that we've missed, a lot of really important illuminating points. So please listen again, but don't worry if you missed out on the Q&A. Send us the questions, because I am looking for an excuse to have webinar follow-up part 2 of this amazing group. So thank you to all the members of the ASEAN Regional Coalition, to hashtag Stop Digital Dictatorship. Thank you to the Manushya team for putting this together, including all our friends, Joe, Poi, and Caroline, who did all the backroom support work. And thank you all the people who've joined us on this session. I've been getting messages not just from ASEAN countries, but also people from Europe and Palestine listening in. So this is such a relevant webinar, and we look forward to seeing you again, to assembling these digital Avengers again, and spending time and sharing what we have been doing and what our concerns are, and that we can have a bigger dialogue. So thank you, everybody. Take care and keep resisting.